Cosmere is a tabletop RPG by Brotherwise Games, published in 2025 after a successful Kickstarter. And by successful, I mean one of the biggest crowdfunds for any tabletop game in history. The campaign raised $15,149,000 from over 55,000 backers, breaking 2 Kickstarter all-time records. It surpassed Avatar Legends as the most funded tabletop RPG of all time, and then went on to beat Frosthaven as the most funded tabletop game project in Kickstarter's history. In this video, I want to cover one major portion of this Cosmere role-playing game, the Stormlight setting. It comes as 3 books: the handbook that is essentially the core rulebook, the world book, which goes into depth in the setting, and a full campaign book. I actually just want to go over the core rulebook with you in this video because going over all 3 would just take too long. Long story short here is the game is largely built on the design principles of D&D 5e and some older D20 design, which makes it a somewhat unremarkable game at first glance, except since it's based on an extremely complex and vibrant setting, the things that your PC end up doing and becoming are actually pretty unique and fun. But before we dive into the game in earnest, let's examine the source material and why this particular universe has generated such commercial interest. This game and all the settings that will be coming out for it are all based on the novels of Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson has become one of the best-selling fantasy authors of the past 2 decades. Since his debut with Elantris in 2005, he's built a substantial readership through a combination of prolific output and systematic world building. His profile was significantly elevated when he was selected to complete Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series, introducing him to that series' established fan base. However, what distinguishes Sanderson's work from other fantasy authors isn't just individual series success, it's his approach to creating an interconnected fictional universe. The so-called Cosmere is Sanderson's shared universe encompassing multiple novel series including Elantris, Mistborn, Warbreaker, the Stormlight Archive, White Sand, and various shorter works. What makes this more than simply books by the same author is the deliberate interconnectedness. All Cosmere works share consistent underlying magical principles, cosmology, and mythology. Characters occasionally cross between series, and events in one series can have implications for others. And this wasn't an accidental development. Sanderson has stated that when beginning his career, he deliberately chose to write seemingly standalone novels while secretly building connections between them, what he calls a hidden epic. This approach allows him to submit individual books to publishers while constructing a larger narrative framework. The result is a planned sequence of several dozen novels with core storylines spanning the Dragonsteel series, multiple Mistborn eras, and the Stormlight Archive. I should note that at the time of this recording, I've personally only read 3 of Sanderson's mini novels thus far, the first of the Mistborn series, but they demonstrate what I consider a masterclass in world building. The attention to magical systems and cultural development in particular is impressive from a craft perspective, regardless of one's opinion on other elements like character work or prose style. What we have here with the Cosmere RPG represents an interesting adaptation challenge, translating not just one fantasy setting, but a framework designed to support multiple interconnected worlds. The game bills itself as a living RPG that will expand alongside Sanderson's ongoing writing, beginning with Stormlight in 2025, adding Mistborn in 2026, and eventually supporting world hopper campaigns that span multiple planets. Whether this ambitious scope translates effectively to tabletop play is what we're here to explore eventually, but for now, let's look at the Stormlight core rulebook and try to evaluate how Brotherwise Games has approached even this one portion of the body of complex source material that is the Cosmere. I think the first and most important thing that I want to point out is the fact that Brandon Sanderson himself had a huge hand in the development of these games. This may seem intuitive, but more often than not, you'll see authors and source material creators sort of license things off in a fire and forget manner. But in the case of Cosmere, Sanderson worked closely with the game developers to stick to the lore and only create and shape powers and abilities that would make the most sense in the totality of the setting itself. And I think that's an extremely important detail with this game, the fact that Sanderson was closely involved and signed off on everything, because most of the people who backed this game are first and foremost fans of the Sanderson novels. The setting details matter to them. So before we continue, I have to note that discussing this setting as presented in this book does present spoilers for the novel Oathbringer and maybe a couple other Stormlight novels. There are no spoilers for what any specific characters in the novels do, but the state of the world itself and how it changes is revealed a bit. The setting of Stormlight is basically this. It's one planet and one continent, both called Rashar. On Rashar, there was an indigenous race called the Singers. They were humanoids with marbled skin and carapace of various colors, and they could attune to the wisps of ever-present force in the universe, those wisps being called Spren. Spren comes up a lot, so remember Spren. Well, somehow humans showed up on the planet. I'm not sure how interplanetary travel works in this fantasy setting, but yeah, at some point they showed up as refugees and sort of coexisted with the Singers, but eventually brought back their god of hatred, Odium, who in this setting is a real god or super being of some sort and is genuinely a hater. Well, there was another god named Honor, and Honor fought Odium using super soldiers over several cataclysmic wars that ravaged the continent several times over. This was bound to keep happening until humans figured out how to bond with those Spren, specifically Spren which had achieved self-awareness. Just as an analogy, you can think of Spren as little fairies or spirits that take on any imaginable shape and who exist on a different plane, but who occasionally flit into the physical plane. Anyway, the humans who figured out how to bond with the Spren developed as champions of the god called Honor, and they were called Radiant Knights. They beat the bad guys again and again, and the wars eventually ceased. But for mysterious reasons, the Radiant Knights disbanded and the Singers entered a clouded mental state that allowed them to become enslaved by humans. There's actually a lot of former and present slavery in this setting, by the way. It's a thing. But yeah, there were many generations of relative peace on Rashar, except humans had enslaved a large portion of the indigenous population until one day a small contingent of Singers, called Listeners, managed to summon a massive magical storm that basically woke up all the Singers and snapped them out of their clouded mental state. So these newly emancipated Singers now live in human society ostensibly free, but it's complicated. Unfortunately, that massive magical storm has now brought on a new period of widespread upheaval, and it's led by none other than the god of hate, Odium. Fortunately, radiant Spren that are able to bond with humans have started popping up here and there, and Radiant Knights are back. And if you can get your PC to level 2 and the GM allows it, which they should, then you can be a Radiant Knight and fight the forces of evil that have returned to Rashar. You know, that's the long and short of the basic history, but I've only actually covered about 3% of the setting. I'm trying to keep this short and contained to the rulebook, but I have to mention that in the 280-page setting book, there is ample description of a very important meteorological feature of the continent, and that is the high storms. These storms are like Category 5 hurricanes that sweep regularly across the land, and all animal and plant life have adapted to surviving the brutal storm fronts that toss boulders around and generally cause a ruckus. But the interesting thing is that these storms regularly coat the surface of the land with a magical dust or sediment that is absorbed and captured and even breathed in by humans and Singers. And that magical dust is the main source of the magic in this entire setting. Okay, here's the part of the game that I think I was most surprised by at first, but then realized was probably the most predictable. The basis of this game is essentially D&D 5e in terms of its dice resolution and level of rules minutia. Technically, they do not evoke the 5e SRD or give any credit to the designers of 5e as far as I can tell, but if you're familiar with picking a skill and then rolling a d20 and adding that skill's modifier to meet or exceed a difficulty class, and you're working with 6 core stats and 18 skills, and advantage and disadvantage, etc., then you're going to be instantly familiar with the rules of this game. That being said, this game does add a few little innovations to the mechanics. The first is that on really important rolls, the GM might have a player roll a d6 plot die, which provides a 1 in 3 chance of creating a so-called opportunity or beneficial effect, regardless of if the overall roll was a success or not. There's also a 1 in 3 chance of producing a complication. But interestingly, the complication will also actually add either 2 or 4 to your total roll, counting towards a possible success. This bonus is indicative of a very important feature of this game, and that is the fact that this is a fantasy superhero game, much like D&D 5e. Your character is meant to rise to great power relatively quickly, and the rules are meant to elevate you, not beat you down and kill you like old school D&D or some other more grimdark iterations of fantasy RPG design, which is fine. This is a whole genre of RPG gaming unto itself, and anyone signing up for a Stormlight adventure is probably wanting to assume the power and importance of the main characters from the novels. So 5e is a good fit. It's also more lucrative to market to 5e players, who happen to comprise the majority of RPG players out there. For the record, in this video, I'm going to gloss over most of the rules, except where they depart in an interesting manner away from 5e. Your character has 3 point pools to worry about. Health, which is your, hit points. Focus, which is spent to use talents and other abilities or to withstand manipulation. And investiture, which is the awkwardly named spiritual resource of this universe. Think of it like the Force from Star Wars, except that you can also imbue items with it, at which point that item is, quote, invested. Starting characters actually don't have investiture. It's only when you later start a radiant path that you start tracking these magical points. One of the most striking things about character creation in this setting is the fact that you can only choose from 2 playable ancestries, humans or singers. If you've watched my channel for some time, you'll have noticed that I'm often bringing up the fact that I don't like Halloween Town or zoo settings where there are 25 races of humanoids all living in the same world, just due to the fact that Sanderson's Stormlight novels are centered around 2 humanoid species. The game designers were guided into offering just these 2, and it's great. The depth of the relations between these 2 races is a lot greater than it ever could have been if there were 5 or 10 races. As far as what you actually get when choosing human, there's nothing particularly distinctive. You choose ancestry talents as you level up, but if you choose a singer as your ancestry, it's a lot more complicated. The main feature of singers is the fact that you can change your form, or shapeshift to a degree. These forms are unlocked as ancestry talents that you choose as you level up, and they each come with mechanical bonuses to one kind of action or another. This is a point in the game where it's kind of an awkward joint between novel and RPG, but I'm not sure the designers could have done it any other way. When you're making a 5e style RPG, sometimes things just have to be squeezed and reduced down into little roll bonuses. In a way, these singers changing into these different forms are at the heart of this setting. When you think of Lord of the Rings, the most prominent aspect of playing in that setting are the elves, dwarves, halflings, and humans that you interact and adventure with. In Rashar, it's humans and inevitably these singers who take on all these different forms. Singers are just going to be a lot of what you remember about this game. Okay, so the PCs in this game sort of grow on 2 different levels. At the first level, you have your mundane heroic path. This could be one of 6 things: agent, envoy, hunter, leader, scholar, or warrior. A party could conceivably play entire campaigns just unlocking the talent trees for these different paths, and the game allows you to freely multi-class across paths. The core path talent trees contain a lot of interesting ways for players to solve problems. Some paths contain combat-focused abilities, and other paths are socially oriented. But again, since you can multi-class relatively quite freely across all 6 paths, you can build a remarkably diverse set of possible characters in terms of their talent range. The radiant paths, which can start at level 2, are really what mechanically and thematically separate this game from D&D 5e and what really makes this a Stormlight RPG. Essentially, your character can choose one of 9 radiant paths, and each path grants access to 3 talent trees. But to get to that level of power, your character has to first choose a so-called first ideal talent, which signifies to the GM that you want to become one of these magical superheroes. In the fiction, this means that your character has attracted the attention of one of 9 types of radiant spren, one who is self-aware and who can talk with you telepathically. These spren are like a little buddy NPC. Right off the bat, if you start going down this path, you are suddenly able to breathe the magical essence of the world called Stormlight. That's the source for those investiture points we mentioned earlier. It's essentially your mana pool, and you spend it on radiant abilities. The most fascinating aspect of all of this to me is the fact that your character has to swear to a set of ideals. Each of those radiant paths has 5 ideals, and your character's relationship with their spren, and even the life of the spren, depends on following those ideals. I love this whole concept because it imbues every PC with purpose to some degree, and a roadmap for how to behave and conduct themselves in the world. I'm not sure if you've ever had this problem, but sometimes players don't quite know how their characters are supposed to react to things. They don't always have a sense of their character's morality or any sort of compass for their social behavior. These ideals are a huge way to fix that problem, and it's enforced with the threat of losing their radiant abilities or even their companion spren. The game actually allows you to change your radiant order after a long night's rest, which gave me a chuckle. I don't know if characters in the novels were swapping out their ideals willy-nilly, but I suspect this was just a designer's choice to allow players to have more fun and zero in on the exact kind of character they want to build without having to start over. The beating heart of this whole radiant path thing boils down to the talents. If you'll note in this cool diagram, every order is associated with 2 forces of nature, in the setting referred to as a surge. These surges are what define the talent trees. So for example, a Dustbringer has access to the surges of division and of abrasion. Just like with the mundane heroic paths, you can unlock these talents as you level up. I wouldn't say that these surges are solidly thematic. They often sort of lurch into generic ability territory, but you can see what I mean when I say this game feels like a 5e spin-off. It wants you to play with a lot of tactics and special little fiddly rules all over the place. Notably, each Radiant Path also has access to a set of talents associated with the Spren type that you've bonded with. In this example, the Spren type is Ash Spren, which essentially gives you 4 possible powers. This stuff on the left details the 4 ideals that you can fulfill through words and deeds. I'm not actually going to go too into it, but this Shard Blade and Shard Plate are extremely hardcore magical items in the setting that can turn your character into a killing machine. The Radiant Paths contain many different themes though, not just super knights with giant swords. There's the Edge Dancer. Okay, that's actually another super knight with a big sword. But there's the Else Caller, who is, okay, well that's a super knight as well. But Light Weavers though excel at, alright, well you'll end up being a super armored, super sworded, super knight any way you slice it. But Shard Blades and Shard Plate is what you signed up for, so deal with it. I don't want to get too into the weeds with the different cultures in this setting, but it's worth noting that there are 12 major cultures and they are all very distinct. The core rulebook gives you a decent explanation of each, but the dedicated world book provides an overwhelming amount of detail on each culture. This is really one of the biggest value propositions of the game, actually, just being a source book for Sanderson's novels. People who are into the Stormlight novels are going to bask in the glory of this cultural gazetteer that just lays out every possible detail of each of these cultures. Believe it or not, we've only gotten through half of the core rulebook. The rest of the book contains chapters on surge abilities in more detail, items and crafting, and several important chapters for the GM on how to run this game. And not to mention the whole setting book and the campaign book. It's really too much to cover in one video. I guess if I had to sum it all up without having played this game yet, here would be my thoughts. Cons. You might need to read the novels. Reading Sanderson's novels is supposed to be enjoyable, and it is. I've been reading them, starting with the first Mistborn novel. But when you look at the totality of his writing, it can be a little daunting, the notion of reading all this stuff in order to get the most out of this RPG. And not only that, Ideally, you are hoping that everyone else at the table has read at least one or two of the novels. Players need some knowledge. I think that at a minimum, with setting-centric games like this, players may need not to have read the source material, but it would be important that they read some of the setting book. I recently made a video about the isekai approach, where players can just make a PC that comes from another world, which excuses their ignorance of the setting and the culture and societal norms that their PC would have otherwise very intimately known about already. But you can only excuse player ignorance so far. If anything, they'll just get more out of the game if they actually know the setting. It's very 5e-ish. Your character is bound to be a fantasy superhero comprised of a giant stack of talents and abilities, as well as NPC followers in the form of spren and squires and other things, such that by the time you are in the later levels, everyone's turn is a slog in combat, and managing characters requires many sheets of abilities. Pros. It's very 5e-ish. I don't think it was any sort of accident that Brotherwise Games chose the 5e framework for Cosmere. It brings familiarity to the widest possible audience of gamers, and it allows them to get the game to their table a lot faster than if the game had been designed with a rule set from the ground up. When reading the rules, I realized that I could probably run the game almost right away as far as managing the dice mechanics. There are a few additions, such as the plot die, that d6 that you might sometimes roll along the d20, and the fact that the plot die generates a whole economy of opportunities and complications, which play into a good number of the talents. But overall, it's just a game built to be played without much friction for the highest number of gamers out there. Setting is mind-boggling. I glossed over it in this video, but the world of Rashar is incredibly well detailed in the world book and full of really unique fantasy cultures and locations. If I'm being honest with you, I don't find Sanderson to be the most literary of writers, but he is an absolute master at world building. His entire body of work all feeds a single setting, and that setting is full of completely self-contained magical rule sets. The most elegant example from the world of Stormlight in particular is the Radiant Orders and the Surges. It's all interlocking and complementary to each other and complete ideals. As I mentioned earlier, I think characters on the Radiant Paths having to swear to and live up to ideals is a powerful design choice. It keeps players on track with their character's morality and gives them a framework for their behavior and decision making. 2 ancestries. I love that you can play as only 2 different humanoid species. It's a matter of depth rather than breadth. And generally speaking, I think it's potentially far more rewarding than having a bunch of different ancestry options. But yeah, that's the Cosmere RPG at a glance. A very long glance, but it's a very big game. I think they pulled off a product that will serve both longtime fans and bring in new folks who have never read any of the novels. That being said, you have to be into the 5e play paradigm, which is high-powered and loaded with talents and abilities that bend the rules 1,000 different ways. And you need to be okay with putting on that Shardblade armor because that's what you're getting. Let me know your thoughts on Cosmere, if you've backed it, and what you're most excited about. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on the novels and how many of them you've read. Thanks as always for watching. I'll see ya.